Here is my latest book, A Catholic Scientist Champions the Shroud of Turin. It was just published in April 2021 by Sophia Institute Press. There are at least 3 links to get access to the book, either through Amazon or Where Do We Come From or Sophia Institute, or you can just Google it with the text A Catholic Scientist Champions the Shroud of Turin. What to expect in this book? It's a rich source for research on the Shroud of Turin. What is the route the Shroud of Turin took? That is historical analysis. We know that it ended up in Turin, or Torino, in Italy. That was in 1578, we have records about that. Before it was in Chambéry in France. We know that from 1453 on in records. It came to Chambéry from Liri in 1356. It got there from Constantinople and Greece in 1204. We have records of that. How did it get to Constantinople? It came from Edessa. We know it was in Edessa in 544. We have records of that. So where did it eventually come from? What I'm trying to prove in this book, it came eventually from Jerusalem. This is what the shroud looks like. Here is the middle, so the body was placed on this shroud and then the top half was folded over it, so we see the back and the front. This is the front view and that is the back view. For later on, it's important to realize that the C14 samples came from this little section, which is basically on the side strip. The side strip was loose from the original one, but was later on attached to it again. It was probably used to bundle arms, feet, and the entire sheet. It is a vaguely visible and hardly recognizable image, almost hidden amidst burn marks, patches, water stains, and creases, because the shroud was folded during its long history. It was not until 1898 that a photographer made a picture of the shroud for the first time. The negatives of the photos, which reverse the light and the dark value, show an image much more detailed than previously available to the naked eye. In 1973, John Jackson and Eric Jumper made computer scans, and they used what NASA had used, elevation variation and relative brightness, to show the different levels. And that revealed a distance information. Some spots were closer to the cloth than others, which shows us that it was really a bodily image and not painted. Then there is textile analysis. The Shroud of Turin is a shroud made of high quality linen. It has a pattern that was typical for that time of the linens in Jerusalem and Israel. That same pattern was found in, but not afterwards. It was specific for the Jewish world at that time. We find it in Masada, that was sieged by the Romans in between 73 and 74. And we find there linens that have the same pattern, which means that it's very old, because we don't find that pattern later on anymore. It's also found in certain Dead Sea Scrolls that were covered with a linen, the scrolls that were in a bag of linen, that same pattern. Then there is pollen analysis. Pollens are very specific sometimes for certain species, or at least for certain genuses of plants. So in 1973, a forensic scientist from Switzerland was asked to examine the shroud with a method he had developed to unravel crimes. Under a microscope he found pollen grains from 58 species of plants. 17 indigenous to Europe, including Leary and Chambéry of course, but the majority indigenous to the area of the Dead Sea and Turkey. His results were confirmed in a study by a prominent Israeli botanist and professor at Hebrew University. He identified many species. Frey's results were confirmed in a study by a prominent Israeli botanist and professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He identified many species of pollen unique to Jerusalem. So we know that the shroud had been there, though later on during its history it was not in Israel anymore, so it must be from that time. Then there is the very infamous carbon dating. That has been, it was supposed to be checked by 7 laboratories, but later on it was reduced to 3, Oxford, Zurich and Tucson, Arizona. 3 samples were cut from the side strip of the shroud, as I showed you before. The 3 labs reported their results to the British Museum in London, and they came up with a verdict in 1988 in the name of science and with the authority of science, and it was published in Nature. The shroud was from between 1260 and 1390. It was a landmine. It was a shock for a lot of people, for that is far away from the time of Jesus. So was that the end of the shroud, of its authenticity? If that were the case, then this whole section would probably be obliterated. But we know, from what I showed you before, that you cannot deny historical records, you cannot deny pollen analysis, you cannot deny textile analysis, so it's very unlikely that that verdict was right. These 3 guys, did they really have the authority to say this? There are many pitfalls. For 30 years almost, shroud scientists would be accusing the museum of keeping the raw data hidden under a shroud of secrecy. But then the French researcher Tristan Casablanca filed a Freedom of Information request. Finally, in 2017, 30 years later, the museum complied with Casablanca's request and released the raw data, finally. It turned out that numerous dates fell outside the range published in Nature. Why were they kept secret? So that makes us already a little hesitant. There are serious pitfalls with this research. First of all, the 3 samples were non-representative. They were taken from one simple spot in the strip to the side. Why? Probably because the Vatican thought that would be the safest spot to take a sample, because this would be detrimental. They were very careful with that shroud, because it was the only document they had, of course. So they were a little reluctant to let people take something from the center. But that means that it was a sample that was non-representative. So there are various kinds of impurities. Dirty hands handled and touched the cloth during its history. You can see here we know from pictures made later during the history of the shroud that it was very common to show the shroud this way. So dirty hands of people, sorry, I'm not offending them, but all hands are dirty. They have all their own DNA on it, they have their own bacteria on it, so there is also the problem that there is bacterial contamination and so on. No wonder that radiocarbon dating revealed a much more recent date. And then there was contamination by dyes that had been added in the past, especially to the strips. So they added dyes to make them look like the original. Then there was blood analysis. The shroud is not a patent artifact. In the book I mention at least 10 reasons why it cannot be a painted artifact, that it's real. We know that there was blood on it. Many spots that show that the victim that was buried in the shroud was tortured enormously. And we know that it was blood because we found iron in those blood stains. And iron is a component of hemoglobin in the red blood cells. And we know that they are very clear on the shroud when you study them more carefully. Some have claimed that it was AB negative blood. That means there were no antibodies found for A or B or rhesus types. But that is not really a proof, for that could be a matter of degradation, that those antibodies disappeared or were broken down, defragmented. Then there is some DNA research which is not very promising at all. DNA gets easily defragmented, so don't go too much by those results. But they did confirm in the late 1990s that there was human DNA on the shroud, which came from white blood cells, because red blood cells don't have DNA anymore. One of the microbiologists reported that he had sequenced portions of the 3 genes from threads taken from the shroud bloodstains. And one of those genes was basically present on the Y chromosome. So we know it was a man. So what? Does that mean anything? Not really. So that leaves us with the question, is this a relic or an icon? When we just look at the face, we find that to be very appealing to most Christians. It gives us an idea what Jesus must have looked like. The shroud keeps surprising us. The best surprise is that it might very well be the Shroud of Jesus. It survived persecutions, fires, mishandling, and scientific scrutiny. If the figure seen on the Shroud of Turin were a painting, then the shroud would rightly be called an icon. But that is very unlikely. Actually impossible, I would say. On the other hand, if it's a real imprint of the crucified body buried within the cloth, then it's a relic of that person, Jesus. Again, DNA research and blood research cannot really prove that. But it is very unlikely that we saved a cloth like that for centuries if it were not from Jesus. For the first Christians, that was a very important relic, and they cherished it. That's why it was kept and saved and protected. It shows us what Jesus must have looked like, something no icon can do. There is much more about the shroud that I mentioned in the book, and I can't go into all the details right here. So I would say read the book. You get it from Sophia Institute, or Where Do We Come From, or from Amazon, and find it with those numbers and those more details. And I think it will give you a much clearer picture that this is a relic and not just an icon.